In this episode, I will be speaking on discovering the leader you carry within. Discovering the leader you carry within. In life, the most effective and influential leaders are born in a saga of crisis. This crisis ignites a leadership demand that compels you to release the leader you carry within. Releasing your full leadership potential will require you to break. It will require you to fall apart into pieces.
This is the Rocky Zapata Leadership Podcast.
Welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Rocky Zapata Leadership Podcast. My greatest desire is for you to learn, and from what you learn, apply these teachings to your daily leadership walk. I personally want to thank those who share this podcast in their social media. If this podcast is a blessing to your life, please share. Please invite family, invite friends, invite everyone to join the Rocky Zapata Leadership Podcast. Help us get this podcast out. And as you know, I always start all my teachings with a funny story. And I heard of this man named Bubba who lived out in the country. And there was this dog that kept showing up at Bubba's house. Bubba's wife said, "Bubba, you have to put the dog in the truck and take him out to the woods and drop him off. That is where he lives, Bubba." So Bubba drove the dog a mile down the road and dropped him off. But when Bubba came back home, the dog was walking up the driveway, practically beat Bubba back. Bubba did the same thing, and it happened again and again and again. His wife said, "Bubba, a mile's too short. You have to take the dog way out. Drive him around in circles and get him all mixed up." Bubba, following his wife's advice, like many of you husbands do out there, drove the dog an hour away. Crisscross country roads Bubba himself had never driven down before, and dropped the dog off miles and miles away. 2 hours later, Bubba called his wife from the truck and asked, "Did the dog make it back home?" She said, "Yeah, here he comes walking up." Bubba said, "Do me a favor, put him on the line. I am lost, in need of some directions." So let's dive into our text today. And before we start, I want to ask you something, you that you're listening to me through this podcast. Have you ever asked yourself one basic, simple question? Am I a leader? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Do I possess leadership qualities? Do I have what it takes to be a leader? Have you ever asked yourself that question? I remember during a conference in New Orleans, a young man asked me that very question. He said, "Rocky, how can I know if I am a true leader?" I mean, in reality, this young man told me, I lead no one but myself. And we're going to answer these questions that trigger this young man to ask himself if he was a leader. That question that has triggered you to look in the mirror to find answers to your leadership calling. But first, let's define what leadership is. Now, I'm sure you've heard this term in the past before somewhere, because it's a very popular term when it comes down to leadership. And the term of that is influence. Leadership is influence. It is the capacity to influence people. Now, if you've heard this before or not, I'm sure you have. I personally heard this term and learned this term in my 4th grade class in Mr. Alvariño's class in Feinberg Fisher Elementary. Mr. Alvariño once said, "My goal is to develop a leadership culture in you to influence the world," because leadership is influence. At that moment, I remember like it was yesterday. I was 10 years old and I learned what leadership entailed. Leadership entailed influence. Now I'm going to ask the question you've been asking yourself Are you a leader? Are you influencing someone out there? Guess what? The answer is yes. There is someone out there who you are currently actively influencing. You might be a CEO of a huge corporation, or you might be a supervisor at your job, or maybe you are neither of the two. You might not be influencing the masses, but there is at least one person that depends in your influence. Remember, there is at least one person that depends in your influence. My first influence was my mother, Martha. I remember my mom. She was a humble waitress, working long hours, a single mother to raise her son. Her work ethic and dedication influenced me in such a way that created the man I am today. My mother was not influencing the masses, but her leadership was influencing just one person, and that one person was and still is today her son. Please, if you're hearing me out there, never underestimate your influence. You have leadership, you have influence. I can guarantee you someone depends in you. They depend in that leadership you carry within. So the question that has triggered us is answered. Yes, you are a leader, because your first influence is your family in your home. You have logged that down. You influence your people in your house. You influence your spouse. You influence your kids. You might not be influencing the masses, but you are influencing someone that depends in you. But that is the general term of leadership. Influence. It's very general. But leadership goes far beyond that. What are leaders? Let me tell you what leaders are. Leaders are selfless. Leaders are servants. Leaders serve as a stepping stone for others to succeed. Real leaders compel others to victory. Real leaders compel others to victory. This is what leadership entails. Now, what is not a leader? Please don't ever do this during your leadership walk. What is not a leader and what leadership is not. Leadership is not fear. Leadership is not manipulation. And leadership is not intimidation and should not be ran with these three factors. You should never run your leadership under those factors. I mean, view modern time Latin America, for example. Several head of states, unconstitutional head of states, self-proclaimed presidents carry a leadership that is based in fear. It is based in manipulation and is based in intimidation. And those three factors drive out violence through a tyranny. These tyrants start killing their own people to stay in power because they will do anything to keep power. But keeping that power means fear, means manipulation, means intimidation, and it means a violence model. I mean, during this very moment is when the most effective leaders are born, during a saga of crisis, of this type of crisis. This crisis ignites a leadership demand that compels you to discover the leader you carry within. Only a crisis will compel you to ignite your leadership demand. Remember, only a crisis will compel you to ignite your leadership demand. My mother went through a divorce crisis. She went through a loneliness crisis. And both of those crises in her life ignited a demand to lead. It ignited a demand to lead. These two crises activated in my mother a fatherly role. Not only did she not need to be a mom, but now she also needed to be a father. What crisis are you currently confronting? You might feel as if your crisis has no way out and you will sink with your crisis. But in reality, that crisis is igniting in you the leader you have been called to be. Remember, you never lose in a crisis. Never. Losing is not an option. A crisis only has two conclusions. Either you win or either you learn. And learning is the stepping stone to winning. So in reality, a crisis is only geared to make you win, to make you better, to make you healthier, to make you stronger, to make you faster, to make you bigger, and to make you fearless. I'm going to repeat this again for you. You never lose in a crisis. Never. Losing is never an option. You need to tell yourself, losing is never an option. A crisis only has two conclusions. Either you win or either you learn. And learning is the stepping stone to winning. In reality, a crisis is only geared to make you win, to make you better, to make you healthier, to make you stronger, to make you faster, and to make you bigger. And a crisis will definitely make you fearless. Your best teacher will be a crisis of financial failure, a crisis of personal failure, a crisis of spiritual failure, a crisis of political failure, a crisis of social failure, and even a crisis of relationship failures. A crisis where you feel the whole world is against you. At that moment, you're igniting your leadership demand. Maybe it was never in your plans to take leadership roles, but your crisis ignited that demand. Your crisis ignited a sleeping giant, the sleeping giant you carry within. Release that giant. Look at these leaders that found themselves in a saga of crisis just like you. And we're going to study leaders that through that crisis ignited a leadership demand for their time. First, take Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for example. Remember his speech, "I have a dream"? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the model of equality, civil rights, freedom, and respect for all. He led a movement that changed the course of American history. Listen to these two inspirational quotes by Dr. King. One of them is, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." And the second is, "Let no man pull you so low as to hate him." What crisis did Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. encounter? A crisis of inequality, a crisis of civil rights, a crisis of freedom, and a crisis of respect to all human beings, regardless of their color. This crisis in the United States allowed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to ignite a leadership demand that compelled him to discover the leader he carried within. And due to this crisis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made history in the United States. He became a leader within the human rights history, a symbol of human rights. So whatever crisis you're going through right now, whatever crisis you're confronting, it's only going to make you better. Second, look at Sir Winston Churchill. What crisis did he encounter? Remember when Great Britain was fighting to save England and most of Europe from Nazi Germany led by Adolf Hitler? And this was way prior to the United States entering World War II. But the crisis went beyond that. Germany was too strong. Adolf Hitler was too strong, and Great Britain was fighting by themselves. Sir Winston Churchill, at this point, 66 years old, imagine 66, was considered a nobody in politics before becoming prime minister. But the current national crisis of rulership by a Hitler dictatorship trying to take over England and most of Europe allowed Mr. Churchill to ignite a leadership demand that compelled him to discover the leader he carried within. When no one believed in him anymore, he believed in himself. Listen to what Mr. Churchill said himself. This is his words. "I felt if I was walking into destiny. I felt if I was walking into destiny, and that all my past life. I felt as if I was walking into destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." So he's trying to tell us, for the last 66 years, I was being prepared for this trial. Third, Nelson Mandela. What crisis did Nelson Mandela confront? a racial inequality in South Africa. This racial inequality crisis allowed Mr. Mandela to ignite a leadership demand that compelled him to discover the leader he carried within. Mr. Mandela wanted to establish racial equality in South Africa. He wanted a free and democratic society for everyone, black and white. During this crisis in South Africa, Mr. Mandela fought through the crisis, and this crisis brought on another crisis. Mr. Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. But listen to what Mr. Mandela had to endure. Life in jail plus racial inequality battle. During his trial, Mr. Mandela said, listen to what he said during his trial. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if it needs to be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Imagine those words during the trial. Mr. Mandela spent the next 28 years in prison. Yes, 28 years. Imagine that. His whole life. Once released from prison, Mr. Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 and was elected president in an open, democratic, free elections, serving his country from 1994 to 1999. Mr. Mandela's leadership changed South Africa's government and policies. It was because of the crisis that Mr. Mandela was able to lead change in South Africa. Remember, a crisis is necessary for growth. A crisis is necessary for growth. Your crisis is preparing you for your leadership destiny, for you to reign over your territory. Homologous to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Sir Winston Churchill, and Nelson Mandela, their crisis created their leadership. Remember, their crisis created their leadership. Your crisis is going to ignite a leadership demand that will compel you to discover the leader you carry within. So don't complain about your crisis. Learn from your crisis. Become a champion out of your crisis, because your crisis is going to ignite a leadership demand that will compel you, that will force you to discover the leader you carry within.
Thank you for joining us at the Rocky Zapata Leadership Podcast.